It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Graeme MacQueen. Graeme MacQueen received his PhD in comparative religion from Harvard University and taught in the Religious Studies Department of McMaster University for 30 years. A textual scholar whose publications on ancient Pali and Sanskrit literature include a critical study of the Sramanyapula Sutra, he is also a noted figure within the peace movement. In 1989, he helped found McMaster's Center for Peace Studies. He served as director of the center from 1989 to 1996 and as co-director of peace-building programs in Sri Lanka, Gaza, Croatia, and Afghanistan. Among them, the Health of Children in War Zones project, which was active in 3 war zones, and the Media and Peace Education project in Afghanistan. His publications in this field include 2 books, as well as articles in such journals as The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, Peace and Change, and Medical Crossfire. Professor MacQueen has more recently become a recognized authority on aspects of the evidence relating to 9/11, applying the careful scholarship of his textual work to analyses of the witness testimony related to the destruction of the World Trade Center, the physics of the North Tower collapse, the seismic evidence, and the anthrax attacks. Professor MacQueen's evidence this morning will be on the subject of eyewitness evidence of explosions in the Twin Towers, compilation of eyewitness testimony. Graeme MacQueen. I move this one? Oops. Let's see.
Perhaps someone could tell me which computer my presentation is on.
I think it's on the right.
We think it's that one, Graeme.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Yes, we'll do this. Thanks, Adnan. Good. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. That's okay. I put it down. Well, good morning, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Michael. As you know, some of us think that the 3 buildings at the World Trade Center, buildings 1, 2, and 3, were brought down through a process of controlled demolition. So the question naturally arises, if that's the case, that seemingly outlandish thing, if that's the case, surely somebody on the scene would have noticed something, especially if this is, in any sense, a standard controlled demolition which uses explosives. Surely somebody would have heard them, or seen them, or felt them. And the answer, of course, is they did. And my job today is to give a brief overview of some of the eyewitness statements. I say some because my collection is far from comprehensive, but it should give you a pretty good taste of what this literature, as well as some of the video footage, looks like. A couple of the video clips I'm using were shown yesterday by Richard Gage, but I think it's worth looking at them again. I'm noted for my slightly plodding, slow way of going through all this material, and I think that kind of attention is sometimes called for. Now, some people would like to cut off this inquiry at the root by suggesting that eyewitness statements are irrelevant. The usual phrase is eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, that it's soft evidence, it's vulnerable evidence, it can be dismissed. I'm not going to spend too long on this objection because I think it's extraordinarily weak. I think it finds no support from the careful social scientific study of eyewitness evidence, which has gone on for decades, nor does it find support from the use of eyewitness testimony in the legal framework. Moreover, one of the gold standards on the investigation of explosions as well as fires, the National Fire Prevention Association handbook says very clearly, the investigator should take into consideration all the available information, including witness statements. Not a surprising position, but important nonetheless. I also want to point out that the government accounts, 9/11 Commission report and the NIST report, do not take issue with my general position. They agree that eyewitness testimony is important. In fact, the 9/11 Commission report would fall apart entirely without this form of evidence. And NIST even acknowledges that eyewitness testimony is important in determining how the buildings came down. Now, they don't follow up on that principle, but the position is clear, and it's not any different from mine at the theoretical level. So there's no disagreement. We can proceed with our investigation. What I want to do is before I make my 3 points today, it might be sensible to give you a little bit of autobiographical stuff. I got into this issue in 2006 after reading an excellent article by David Ray Griffin, Explosive Testimony. He and researchers working with him had discovered the oral histories of the New York firefighters, which had been released in late 2005 after the New York Times threatened the city of New York with a court case. And these comprised somewhere between 10 and 12,000 pages of eyewitness statements from members of the Fire Department of New York, the FDNY. And, said Dr. Griffin, there are many accounts of explosions around the time the buildings came down. Now, the official story has no room for such explosions, so this was interesting. I was in the lucky position of being able to put aside all my other work for some months and read through all of that material. And it's something that a textual scholar doesn't get a chance to do very often, to take texts which almost no one in the world has read through, probably no more than the number of fingers on my hand, had read through all that material at that time, looking for a specific thing. And as a result of that study, I published an article in the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which was a fairly new journal at the time, in which I not only described but gave the statements of 118 members of the FDNY. I myself was surprised by the number of eyewitnesses that talked about explosions. Now, what I'm going to do today builds on that earlier work. I've been doing other kinds of research in the meantime, but I will try and explain some of the issues that arise in the study of this material, and my list today will be somewhat expanded, so it won't be simply a regurgitation of that study. 3 points I want to make today. First, the conviction that the towers came down because of explosions, as opposed to structural failure, was common on 9/11. And this is my typical very cautious statement. I mean, it was common is an understatement. It's all over the place on 9/11. Secondly, there is substantial eyewitness evidence supporting this conviction. And third, this eyewitness evidence has been ignored or suppressed by the 9/11 Commission and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. We begin then with the conviction that the towers came down because of explosions was common. Now, why is this even important? It took me a few years to realize how important this simple point really is. And I'll try and explain to you. It seems to me there's a very common presupposition, occasionally voiced but often unvoiced, and it is this: that on 9/11 everybody, especially those on the scene, knew that the towers came down because they were hit by airplanes. And the airplanes obviously damaged them. And the fires subsequently damaged them. And through some kind of structural failure, which usually people don't want to get into in detail, they came down and it was obvious. And that was the story, and that was the perception, and that was the belief. And that people who suggest controlled demolition brought them down are latecomers. They're revisionists. They're people who came along later with their cockeyed theory. and they perhaps have some special conspiratorial way of thinking, which leads them to unnecessarily complicate a simple situation. And I think this is a very powerful presupposition. I get this almost every time I give an interview to the media on it. And it's false. It's a falsification of history. The idea that these buildings came down because of explosions, and even, more specifically, because of explosives planted in the building, was an idea found all over the place on 9/11. On the scene by eyewitnesses, even on television, on the radio, in the paper. Very common. And it's important that we know that. It changes our perspective on this. So, I'm going to make this point as quickly as I can by giving you 5 examples of people on 9/11 who made this judgment. We begin with I just put in a couple of slides to show you the kinds of images we're used to, which people saw on 9/11. Some of them saw it up close, some of them saw it on TV, and some of them made the not unnatural conclusion that an explosive event was taking place. So here's my first video. The gentleman here, the reporter here is N.J. Burkett, and he's working for ABC News 7, and he's standing very near the towers. Okay, sound. Let's stop. Sound technician. Okay, we're just going to take a break till we get it worked out here, because maybe the sound on the machine is not. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, take one and two, one. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the 2 towers. Debris continues to fall and to rain on the people below. There are people hanging from the windows 90 stories up, and a number of bodies have actually hit the pavement. Another one? Take 2. Take 2 and 2, 1. This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the 2 towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
So this man had to pick up, he and his companion had to pick up the camera and run for their lives. And I don't see any evidence that Mr. Burkett had a particular conspiratorial frame of mind. And he certainly didn't come around after the event. This is his spontaneous judgment, standing in a place of great danger. He says, before the material even hits the ground, a huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way. And he runs. And just so you know, he also had to run for his life when the North Tower came down a little bit later. And he described that as a blast. That's example number 1. My next example is textual. I got this from looking at the same-day coverage by CNN. That's about 11 and a half hours, I think. I was surprised to find that Mayor Giuliani is asked at least twice on air on CNN on the day about explosions in the buildings. The second occasion takes place at roughly 2:39 p.m. in the afternoon at a press conference, where a female reporter, who is off-screen, so I don't know her identity, asks him the following question. Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the 2 buildings down? Was it caused by the planes or by something else? You notice that she doesn't ask if there were explosions, she assumes it. She doesn't ask if they brought the buildings down, she assumes that as well. She just wants to know what caused them. Was it the planes or something else? Third example is one of several pieces of video footage that has been got from the National Institute of Standards and Technology through a Freedom of Information Act request. It's called the Matthew Shapoff video, and I'm showing you a tiny fragment of it. So here we have some people who are off screen in, I assume, their apartment or condo in New York City, watching and filming, in this case the North Tower, in the distance, and we can hear them talking in the background. And it's particularly the man who talks here that I want you to listen to. I assume it's Matthew Shapoff.
I had my shoes on and I was about to go out the door. I would have been walking around when this happened. Oh my God! That was a bomb that did that.
Oh, God, look at that!
That was a fucking bomb that did that. There's no goddamn way that could have happened.
God!
Again, this gentleman didn't come along after the scene. He made his judgment as the North Tower came down, and he made it just as the debris was beginning to hit the ground. That was a bomb that did that, he said. Now, by the way, I just want to remind you what I'm trying to prove here. I'm not using Shapoff's evidence to argue that controlled demolition took place. I'm not even at that stage of the talk yet. I'm simply making a historic point about history, that there were people on that day who made the spontaneous judgment that these buildings exploded. My next example is from firefighter Christopher Fenyo, and this is taken from the FDNY oral histories. And he's talking about a period after the South Tower came down, that was the first tower to come down, and before the North Tower came down. So sometime roughly between 10 and 10:30 in the morning, it turns out there was a debate happening among firefighters at the scene. Quote, "At that point, a debate began to rage because the perception was that the building looked like it had been taken out with charges." In other words, not merely that it came down because of explosions in some general sense, but that the building had been rigged for demolition. They were debating that before 10:30 in the morning on 9/11. And that's the debate that is still raging 10 years later. The debate between some kind of structural collapse hypothesis and the explosion hypothesis. And my fifth and final example is one that Richard gave yesterday, so I'll be brief. PENT bomb, as Barbara Honegger pointed out, is the FBI acronym for their investigation of 9/11, and it stands for Pentagon Twin Towers Bombing Investigation. When I first heard that years ago, I thought, what a strange title, because the official narrative has no room for bombs at any of the locations. Is it possible that some members of the FBI actually thought that it was a bombing originally? And that's when we go to Jack Kelly's very interesting statement, which you heard yesterday, but I'll give it again. This is on 9/11 itself, when he reports live that the FBI's working theory at that point is that, quote, "At the same time two planes hit the building, there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the building, which exploded at the same time and brought both of them down." So that according to him, the FBI had an explosion theory. And when we look at the television footage from that day, we find it's not just the FBI. There were police officers talking about explosives in the building. There were firefighters talking about a theory of explosives in the building. It was all over the place. Reporters, everybody. So that's the first point that I wanted to make today, and it's a simple point, and it's really nice to be able to prove something. You can prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the theory that the buildings were brought down through controlled demolition, both in the broad and the narrow sense, that is, that they were brought down, through explosions, whether they be natural explosions in the building or explosives. These theories were very common on 9/11. Now I go to my second point. There is substantial eyewitness evidence supporting the explosion hypothesis. And here's where I actually try to build the case that there were a lot of witnesses and that some of this testimony or these statements are quite detailed. They're rich. and they tell us a great deal. And I thought it might be useful to divide this up into two sections, one in which I talk about quality and one in which I talk about quantity. By quality, I mean I'll just look at a few short eyewitness statements, which are rich and detailed, and we'll just talk about them for a few minutes. A couple of these video clips you've seen before, but we'll look at them again. And then quantity, I'll try and give a kind of overview of, how many witnesses we're talking about here. All right, so we begin with the famous clip from the Naudet brothers film, the two French filmmakers who were there on 9/11 and who interviewed people and so on. So this is from the day. The gentleman, the firefighter on the right is Dennis Tardio, and on the left is Pat Zoda. And let's listen to their description of what the North Tower, because we have to be specific here, what the North Tower looked like as it came down.
Nobody yet. Well, fuck, what do we do? We made it outside, we made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was like, it was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
as if they
detonated,
were planned
yeah.
to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running.
Just ran up west.
And then you just sort of, this cloud of shit chasing you down.
Okay. Now, it's worth pausing to think about what these guys are saying, because I have had so many people dismiss this kind of evidence that I'm dealing with, usually with a wave of the hand, an impatient gesture. Eyewitness evidence is notoriously unreliable was the first one. We dealt with that. The second one is, I don't care if a few people heard booms in the building. That could have been anything. It could have been anything. That is an extremely unscientific approach. If I asked an historian why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and he said, it could have been anything, I would say it's a very poor historian. The task is to say, what you say is, it obviously couldn't have been anything. It had to be something quite specific, and our job is to figure out what that is. So, did these gentlemen talk about booms? Yes. Dennis Tardio uses the term boom, 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 boom. But there's nothing vague about them. Nor do they just hear. They see. They both saw the building coming down. They say it quite explicitly. It looked like. They affirm each other's testimony. And what did it look like? They convey this in part with these distinctive hand gestures, like little karate chops. This is what they both do. Dennis Tardio starts it off, the hand gestures. Pat Zoda agrees, does the same thing. Tardio then does it again. And this is what he said. This is what apparently this means. It means that there were a series of energetic and distinct events which began high and went down low rapidly and at regular intervals. There's nothing vague about that. That is extremely distinctive. And this is what they say. Zoda, floor by floor, it started popping out. Tardio, it was as if they had detonated, as if they were planted to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. Zoda, yeah. Nothing vague. This is rich testimony. It deserves to be pondered. Cannot be easily dismissed. Now, I want to take that hand gesture as a symbol of what it means to look for corroborating testimony. And that's why when we go on to our second rich case, we're now talking about quality testimony. I want to take Paul Lamosa. You also saw this clip yesterday, but again, we're going to pause on it a bit. This man was helping to do a commercial near the World Trade Center on 9/11. He was building a set, and his testimony is very specific and detailed, and he also gets very moved. If you watch the whole thing, begins to cry. He was in the thick of things. And here is a brief clip from what he says. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting this to show. I'm not used to this computer.
Can you tell us your name?
My name's Paul Lemos. All of a sudden I looked up and about 20 stories below, at least that's what it looked like to me, about 75 flights up below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. Just went down, and then I just saw the whole building just went, oh, and as the bombs were going, people just started running, and I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and then I just turned around, and I just started running for my life, because at that point, World Trade Center was coming right down, right above us.
This is very good eyewitness testimony. This, as far as I can tell, this footage is entirely independent from the Nade brothers film. That means this gentleman, Paul Lemos, did not see the firefighters, and they did not see him. And here they are independently on the day itself, and we know it's the day itself. We can see Building 7 in the background during Paul Lemos' testimony. The same gesture. Boom, 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 boom. Here's what he says. And by the way, this man doesn't guard himself. The firefighters don't go so far as to say they were explosions. They just say they looked like them. He doesn't guard himself. Here's his gestures. Here's his words. All of a sudden, I looked up, and about 20 stories below the fire, I saw from the corner, he's talking about the North Tower, the same building that the two firefighters were talking about. I saw from the corner, boom, 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 just like 20 straight hits, just went down. And then I just saw the whole building just went, phew. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And then I just turned around and I just started running for my life, because at that point the World Trade Center was coming right down. Very rich testimony. And I'm going to pause for a moment to say something else about it. If you watch the whole interview, he says at one point, he makes a remarkable statement at one point, that while he was there, after he watched the building come down, they, meaning the authorities presumably, pulled in an architect who came up to Mr. Lemos and told him that he had not perceived explosions. He had not perceived explosions. They told me they weren't explosions, he said. And then he talks about his interaction with the architect. The architect asks him, what did you see? And that's when he goes through the whole thing all over again. And the architect says to him, how fast were they? And he says, like firecrackers. Now, there's no evidence that Paul Lemos was ready to give up what he believed he thought he saw. But already on 9/11, on the scene, he's being told what he didn't perceive. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the architect was there for a sinister purpose, although I suspect he was. But this much at least we can say. There is no way at that point that anyone could have claimed to know scientifically that this man had not perceived explosions. Hadn't studied the rubble, the physical residue, hadn't done a comprehensive study of video or still footage, hadn't done a comprehensive investigation of eyewitnesses. How on earth could he make that judgment? But there's more. He's interfering with a criminal investigation. I don't care whether you look at this as a homicide investigation or a fire investigation or a bombing investigation. In all three cases, it's clear that eyewitness testimony is important and that you go to the scene and you gather it. You don't tell eyewitnesses what they did and didn't perceive. He's interfering with the investigation. And one of the reasons this is so important is because as I read through the firefighters' oral histories, I could see that in the months, they were collected mainly from about October 2001 to January 2002, and that over those months, some of them are beginning to retreat from their statements. Well, maybe I didn't see that. And during that whole period, they are being bombarded, largely through the mass media, with the structural failure hypothesis. And more specifically, the so-called pancake theory, according to which the towers came down because of pancaking floors. Now, that theory was ultimately given up by NIST. So it's sad when you see these people doubting their own senses in favor of a hypothesis which is thoroughly discredited now. But I wanted to give you one or two examples. This may seem like a tangent, but I don't think it is. I think figuring out why people sometimes backed off their their eyewitness statements is quite important. So 3 quick examples from the firefighter's testimony. Dominic DeRubio, speaking of the South Tower. It was weird how it started to come down. It looked like it was a timed explosion. But I guess it was just the floors starting to pancake one on top of the other. That's what he was told, not what he saw. James Drury. We started to hear the second roar. That was the North Tower now coming down. I should say that people in the street, myself included, thought that the roar was so loud that bombs were going off inside the building. Obviously, we were later proved wrong. And finally, John Coyle, firefighter, talking about the South Tower. And he begins in this rather pathetically tentative way. The tower was, it looked to me, I thought it was exploding, actually. That's what I thought for hours afterwards. Everybody, I think, at that point, still thought these things were blown up. Everybody? It's a remarkable statement. Okay, so we've seen 2 examples of what I call quality testimony. And I want to give you a third now. And the third one is meant to answer a specific objection. Remember the various ways of dismissing this testimony that I mentioned? One of them is to say, well, those sounds could have been anything. How do you know they were explosions? They could have been columns breaking. They could have been elevators crashing, bodies hitting the ground, and a number of other examples are given. A couple of, I guess 3 gentlemen, one of whom at least is a very prestigious scholar, published an article a couple of years ago suggesting that the booms were sonic booms from ejections coming from the towers as they came down. I'd be happy to discuss that theory with you later. It's grotesquely unempirical. In any case, I thought it would be good if we could find quality testimony. I shouldn't call it testimony, and it hasn't been given under oath. Quality eyewitness statements, which would be difficult to explain as anything but an explosion. And so I chose Port Authority police officer Sue Keene and her testimony. And I can tell you more later, if you like, about the sources. This particular, eyewitness statements are from a book called Women at Ground Zero, and she gave this quite quickly after 9/11. This would have been, she would have been giving these interviews probably within 2 or 3 months after 9/11, maybe even quicker. And what she says here is, to a large extent, corroborated by her own handwritten submission to the Port Authority Police, and I will show you an example of that handwritten submission in a moment. But first, I want to go through 6 common characteristics of explosions, and then we'll look at what Sue Keene says relevant to each one. And by the way, I'm no explosion expert, but I do know how to read. And the 6 common characteristics are taken from James Thurman's book, Practical Bomb Scene Investigation. Mr. Thurman is a former FBI explosives expert. Oh, I was going to show you an example of the North Tower. Perhaps I should. A clip that you saw yesterday. But here's the point, before I get to Sue Keene. Corroboration is one of the processes we use when we're dealing with eyewitness evidence. We look for other eyewitnesses who can corroborate what the particular eyewitness has said. Excuse me. We look for other eyewitnesses, and we look for entirely different independent types of evidence to see if that will corroborate what the eyewitness has said. So now I'm remembering that I did want to do 2 more things before I move to Sue Keene. First of all, first question, are there other eyewitness reports which support, that is, corroborate, the eyewitness testimony that you saw by Dennis Tardio, Pat Zoda, and Paul Lemos? In other words, are there other eyewitnesses that talk about this very specific process of distinct explosions coming down the towers. And there are, and I'll read 3 of them quickly. So this is corroboration through evidence of the same kind. Ross Melantich, Chase Manhattan Bank, talking about the South Tower. Quote, "It started exploding. It was about the 70th floor, and each second another floor exploded out, for about 8 floors before the cloud obscured it all." Next witness, John Busey, reporter for the Wall Street Journal. "Off the phone and collecting my thoughts for the next report, I heard metallic crashes and looked up out of the office window to see what seemed like perfectly synchronized explosions coming from each floor, spewing glass and metal outward, one after the other from top to bottom, with a fraction of a second between. The floors blew to pieces." That was published in the Wall Street Journal, September 12th. And the third one, Kenneth Rogers, firefighter, talking of the South Tower. "We were standing there with about 5 companies, and we were just waiting for our assignment. And then there was an explosion in the South Tower. A lot of guys left at that point. I kept watching. Floor after floor after floor. One floor under another after another. And when it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb, because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing." These are very clear eyewitness statements. We're not talking about vague booms here. And then I wanted to give you, before I move to Sue Keene, pardon me for the getting out of order here, one example of corroboration through a different kind of evidence. So here is Paul Lemos, who's very specific, that he's very clear that he's talking about the North Tower, and not just the North Tower in general, but a corner of the North Tower, as he talks about these distinctive energetic events. So wouldn't it be good if we had a video clip of a corner of the North Tower? And we do. So we'll look at that. It's a close-up of one of the videos Richard showed yesterday. Excuse me. Now you'll see it in a slightly more close-up. And of course, we can play that again later if anyone would like to. We can play it again if anyone would like to see it later. I've taken it apart frame by frame. You can measure the speed of the ejections, the acceleration, the length. It's very easy to do. And of course, there's plenty of evidence for these ejections in the building. It's not rocket science to figure out how fast they're moving and so on. Now then, now we get to Officer Keene, and let me remind you who she is. She was a member of the Port Authority Police for 13 years, and for 8 years, and prior to that was in the U.S. Army for 13 years. She knew more about explosions than most of us, and had in fact been trained in how to react to explosions so as to not get injured. How do I know? Because she says so. And these are the 6 characteristics and her comments. Sound. Not invariable, but common in relation to explosions. What does she say in her account? A couple of minutes later, it sounded like bombs going off. That's when the explosions happened. Positive blast pressure phase. The device explodes and a pressure wave moves out rapidly in all directions, hot expanding gases and compressing and displacing the atmosphere, creating this potentially very violent movement. And this, of course, this is the effect that Hollywood likes. This is when you see people's bodies being thrown and glass broken and all these. This is where most of the damage takes place. What does she say? The windows blew in. We all got thrown. Each one of these explosions picked me up and threw me. Partial vacuum during positive blast pressure phase. As the atmosphere is rapidly displaced outward, there is a low pressure area created near the site of the explosion, called a partial vacuum here. What does Sue Keene report? There was this incredible rush of air, and it literally sucked the breath out of my lungs. negative blast pressure phase. A low pressure area is an unstable situation. Pretty soon the air will come rushing back in to where it was displaced from. Thurman tells us that this too can be destructive, though it's not as destructive as the positive blast pressure phase. What does Sue Keen describe? Everything went out of me with this massive wind. Stuff was just flying past. Then it stopped and it got really quiet. And then everything came back at us. I could breathe at this point, but now I was sucking all the stuff in, too. It was almost like a backdraft. It sounded like a tornado. Incendiary or thermal effect, obvious. He threw me under the hose, which in a way felt great because I didn't realize until then that my skin was actually burning. I had burn marks, not like you'd have from a fire, but my face was red, my chest was red. And finally, fragmentation and shrapnel. There was stuff coming out of my body like you wouldn't believe. It was like shrapnel. It's still coming out. And now just an example of her handwritten testament, her handwritten statement to the Port Authority Police, which is different from the statement I've used here, but which corroborates it in many important respects. Massive amounts of debris, concrete dust, and bodies or parts were more frequent at this point. Then there was an eerie silence, and it was just like you knew something was going to happen. There seemed to be one explosion after another. I was separated from the guys from the bridge by another explosion, massive again, sucking the air out of your lungs, and then just a wind more intense this time, with larger pieces of debris flying, and so on. She has to end her account. She has to cut off her account before she finishes it because she's getting too emotional. She says, I hope maybe I can come back to this later, but she never does. So I've now completed the first part of this point, namely the dealing with quality eyewitness testimony. And if you were to ask me what do I think Sue Keen perceived, I would say I believe she perceived exactly what she said she perceived. Massive explosions. And any account of the collapse of the towers that doesn't take that into account is flawed. Now I want to go on quickly to the issue of quantity and just give you a little bit of an overview. As I say, my witness list is not comprehensive, but I will be submitting to the Toronto hearings statements from 156 eyewitnesses. So this will be an appendix to my presentation. It's 35 pages long because it includes the actual words of each of these people. I've created a couple of graphs. So this refers to my 156, which certainly, as I say, isn't comprehensive. Most of them are members of the Fire Department of New York because of that extremely rich source, the World Trade Task Force interviews, World Trade Center Task Force interviews. Secondly, Port Authority Police Department, then reporters, and then other, mainly civilians in the location, in that location. And I just want to point out a couple of things quickly about this. First is that about 87% of the witnesses I'm dealing with were first responders, either firefighters or police officers, who had far more experience with explosions than most of us. And I think the evidence, the documents are high quality, is high quality eyewitness evidence. And I could explain a little bit what I mean by that later. The other thing is the reporters. Many of these are video clips, and it took me a while to realize what good evidence this is, that this is unmediated. Nobody's transcribing or interpreting or interrupting or anything. There they are on the scene. Most of this is from 9/11, and some of it is within seconds of the events. And that's very important because, of course, the story changes over time. Second graph has to do with the terms used by the witnesses. And here I have to pause to explain my method a little bit. Again, being troubled by people who claim that there's a vague boom somewhere, and immediately I put them in the list as an explosion witness, I have to explain, if all they said that there was a boom, if all they said was that there was a boom, they're not in the list. they're not one of the 156. I try not to interpret. I get the eyewitness to interpret. They don't get in the list, with one minor exception, the category of other. Other is where I see something that looks like a controlled demolition description, so I put it in. But in all the other cases, they're there because the eyewitness themselves have used a particular term: explosion, or the verb to explode, blast, bomb, blow up, implosion. So in other words, if they don't use the term in the description, they're not in the list. So it's a pretty good list, this 156. And I guess I would just want to point out the obvious, that explosion and explode are far more common than any of the others, but the term bomb, and this also includes related terms like secondary device, is also common. There's 32 cases, and most of them are firefighters. They wouldn't use the term unless they felt this was an explosion that you don't expect to encounter in a building fire. So it's an important category.
Graeme,
yes, Richard.
Question. Would some individuals be using 2 or even 3 or more of these terms?
Yes, it's an important question. The 156 refers to the number of individual people. The number of references to explosion and so on is much higher. So a given witness might use the term explosion 3 or 4 times, or they might use explosion and bomb, or they might, any number of combinations. This is the number of people who use one of these terms at least once. Now, how am I doing for time, Michael?
I'm letting you run over a little bit, Graeme. I'm going to put up this.
Okay, so I've got about 5 minutes?
You can take 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, thank you. There is a third objection that's often raised to our talk about explosions in the towers. And I don't think I'm going to have time to deal with it very well in my talk. If you wish, the panel or the audience may want to return to it later. But the objection is this. Of course there were explosions. You encounter all kinds of explosions in office fires, especially in large office fires like this. So the fact that people perceived explosions doesn't mean that they were from explosives or that they were deliberately planted. Now that, of the 3 major common objections, that is, I think, the most serious one. And I don't want to be seen as rushing over it. But I'll just say briefly now that although I'm certainly not an explosion expert, I have studied the manuals, and as far as I have been able to determine, there are only 4 major kinds of explosions that we would have expected to encounter that would be major, fairly major explosions in a natural fire. If others want to add other ones, let them do so, but the 4 that I have found are, first of all, a BLEVE, which stands for boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion, as when a boiler blows up, electrical explosion, smoke explosion or backdraft, and finally combustion explosion, natural gas or jet fuel vapor. I believe that none of these, either singly or in combination, accounts for the eyewitness evidence that we have, not to mention the other evidence, which you'll be hearing later today. And I can say a little bit more, if you like, about that after in the Q&A. But for now, I need to go to my third point, which is that this eyewitness evidence has been ignored or suppressed by the 9/11 Commission and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I can be fairly brief here, because if we ask how many references there are to eyewitness statements about explosions in the towers in the 585 pages of the 9/11 Commission, we find that there is 1 sentence fragment. They are discussing firefighters who were in the North Tower when the South Tower came down, and this is what they say. Those firefighters not standing near windows facing south had no way of knowing that the South Tower had collapsed. Many surmised that a bomb had exploded. That's it, in 585 pages. This implies that eyewitnesses who thought there were explosions were in the North Tower at the time the South Tower came down. In fact, most of them weren't. It also implies that they made a mistake. And they made that mistake because they had an impeded view. They weren't near a window. They couldn't see what was going on. This is grotesquely misleading. Many eyewitnesses were looking directly at the towers. And I've already showed you examples. So whether it's deliberate or not, this is an extremely inadequate and misleading way of dealing with this important testimony. If we ask about the National Institute of Standards and Technology now, which was given the specific job of figuring out why these buildings collapsed, how many references are there to eyewitnesses to explosions in the towers in the 295 pages of the final report? 0. Not one. Now, some people think, oh, well, but that's natural because NIST only deals with hard stuff, you know, like column size and whatnot. They're not concerned with soft stuff like eyewitness evidence. False. NIST was proud of the interviews it conducted. It had a sophisticated methodology. It planned it from early on, and you can find it described in Chapter 7. Phone interviews, one-on-one interviews, face-to-face, focus groups. But they appear not to have directed them to this question, so that they give detailed information about what was happening at various times in the building, but we hear nothing about this. Now, you need to know that the 9/11 Commission and NIST had access to the same material that I have access to. It's not as if I have some mysterious sources here. And yet they both miss my 156 eyewitnesses to explosions, not to mention many other eyewitnesses that are not in my list. Whether that's deliberate suppression of evidence, which would be a crime, or whether it's simply massive incompetence, does not concern me today, because either way, we have an investigation that is thoroughly inadequate, and that's why we need a new one. And I want to end with one last guy, Gary Gates. I looked up and the building exploded. The whole top came off like a volcano. And, you know, Gary Gates could, of course, be wrong, but if you ask me if 156 are wrong, I'm going to say no, I don't think so. Thank you.
I would now like to ask our panelists for their questions to Professor MacQueen. Yes, Professor Jenkins?
I'm particularly impressed by the care with which you've distinguished levels of evidence, if you will, evidence from sights and sounds about explosions, and then separating that from evidence about the cause of these explosions, namely explosives. I think that's a very constructive kind of analysis. Could you tell us something more about how the evidence for the cause of these explosions is indeed explosives?
Right. I'm going to use 3 categories that seem to me to be important. I call them identification, force, and pattern. The first is probably the weakest, but it's still worth mentioning. This is identification. Namely that most of my witnesses are firefighters with experience in fires, and they do not identify the explosions that they encounter as as belonging to the 4 categories. If they thought it was a smoke explosion, perhaps they'd say so. If they thought it was a BLEVE, a boiler exploding, perhaps they'd say so. I find in the 10,000 pages of the oral histories a few little references. Well, when one man says, it was like a smoke explosion on a tremendous scale was going on. Or someone else might say, I saw a bunch of flashes. It could have been electrical, I guess. But they're very tentative and very, very few. So the first point is they don't identify them as belonging to those categories. The second is more important, I think, and it's called force. According to the sources I have read, there is no way any of those kinds of explosions could have torn apart these massive buildings. According to NIST, these buildings were essentially intact below the point where they were hit by the planes. These were extremely strong buildings. You cannot blow them apart with smoke explosions. You cannot blow them apart with any of the four, according to what I've read. Now, I stand to be corrected if someone has different evidence. Not only could they not be blown apart, they could not be blown apart in the way in which we see these buildings brought down, which is with extreme pulverization, massive force, hurling beams, great distances, and so on. And let me just stress that many, many eyewitnesses are very clear about the fact that they're not just seeing explosions, they're seeing them tear the building apart. Mm-hmm. And then finally, third, pattern. I find no evidence that any of these four kinds of explosions would create the distinctive pattern that we see, that the eyewitnesses say that they saw. Regular energetic events coming down at regular time intervals. And that, I believe, is why NIST, when it has to deal with these ejections, tries to come up with a hypothesis which doesn't involve any kind of explosion. They try to say it's air pressure in the tower. And they do that, I believe, because they know that if those are explosions, they have to come from explosives and they have to have been planted.
So the account that says that as the towers collapsed, the compression of air caused these ejections at lower levels, you're ruling out because the pattern of them, the timing of them, is earlier than when any compression could have caused that. Is that correct?
That is one of the reasons why I rule it out. There are two variations on that hypothesis. Back when in the pancake hypothesis days, they said, NIST said, well, actually, I guess this is pre-NIST, so maybe this was FEMA, I don't remember. In any case, the common explanation was that as the floors pancaked, they caused these ejections. Later, when the pancake hypothesis was given up by NIST, what did they have? They had nothing. So they claimed that the top part of the towers acted as a piston, right, and that the rest of the tower was like a tube, and the piston in the tube. I don't think that stands up to even the most rudimentary examination. And I do want to point to Kevin Ryan in the corner, who wrote a very fine article on these ejections a few years ago, which in my view pretty much ends the discussion.
Do you think that what you've seen in these testimonies, in the witness reports, does it lead you to think that the peripheral columns must have been set with explosions? Can you tell whether these things, these ejections, emanate from the edge of the building or from the center of the building?
I don't really want to go there.
Okay.
I don't know enough about demolition. The only thing I'll say is that the idea that this is caused by pressure in the building, I know that's not what you're asking now,
okay,
but I want to say this anyway, and that the ejections came from the windows is clearly false, because if we analyze frame by frame the video that I showed you there, it's pretty clear that some of these focused ejections are coming directly from the corner, and that means there were no windows in the corner. They were coming through the aluminum cladding, right, and probably between the perimeter columns, but I don't want to say more than that.
Finally, let me acknowledge that you're doing much more than taking a poll, but of witnesses, of testimonies here. But how many records, individual records, did you scan to produce the 156 positive reports?
It's easy to answer that in the case of the FDNY oral histories, a little bit harder in the other cases. That's why that's such an important group of material, because you can talk about percentages and what's representative and so on. So the FDNY oral histories have statements from approximately 500 members of the FDNY. And of the 500, we can say 118 mention explosions. And that becomes especially significant when you realize that almost without exception, they were not asked about explosions. in the interview. They volunteered that. It's just one more statement. It's difficult to do that kind of analysis with the other material.
I understand.
Yeah.
Professor Johnson.
I'm very interested in the process by which eyewitness testimony is transformed or recanted over time. I wonder if you've had a chance to look at that process, and the question is, what is the mechanism by which this transformation occurs? Does it appear to be systematic? Is it something that is more amorphous that comes through the press? Is this kind of a contrived process, or is it sort of random?
Right. It's a good question that I can't answer very well. From time to time, we hear claims that the firefighters, for example, were told not to talk about explosions. But I haven't done the research, so I can't say if that's true. So what I've seen would fall under the category of amorphous. It's clear when I read the firefighters' testimonies that they were aware of the structural failure hypothesis, and not just aware that it was out there, but aware that it had some kind of imprimatur as the truth. And especially the pancake hypothesis, which was the main one being promulgated by the press during those early months, they refer to it repeatedly.
Professor Lee.
I would like to follow up on Professor Johnson, because early on you said, you talked about Paul Lemos being approached by an architect, and then the architect saying, no, you didn't see that. Mm-hmm. And so that suggests that insiders were on the scene, walking around, you know, and trying to, you know, engage in damage control. So it's pretty intriguing, you know, just exactly who was this architect?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And was he an architect at all? I don't know. If you watch the CNN coverage, there is a gentleman, some of you probably know who it is, and I can't remember if he's an architect or an engineer, who is brought on to CNN during the coverage to tell us why the towers came down. And it's structural failure. And you have to remember that you have the anchor, Aaron Brown, standing there saying when one of the towers comes down, it almost looks like one of those planned implosions. But of course it couldn't be. And we have other reporters. He says to one of his, people out in the field, Rose, what do you got? You know, what's happening? Well, the whole top of the tower just blew up. He's getting this. This is on CNN. So then this guy is dragged on to say this is structural failure. How would he possibly have known that on 9/11 with no investigation? So if you ask me what I really think, what the evidence suggests, I think that there was a plan. And I think they started right away.
Okay, thanks.
Signor Imposamato.
Yes, I agree with with the Professor MacQueen in order the opportunity to start a new expertise. It seems that there is a contradiction between the firefighters and the ordinary citizen who were present to event. The issue could only be settled by a scientific analysis ordered by the New York City prosecutor, carried out by physicists, ballistic experts, and chemists. I suggest to send this analysis of Professor MacQueen and other analysis to New York City prosecutor, asking for a new investigation that could be carried out in the respect of principle of due process of law, with the contradiction with the participation both of official expert and victim expert and association expert. This is the solution, according to my opinion. And you agree about this suggestion?
Well, I think the suggestion is excellent in terms of what needs to be done. But I'm not sure that I understand your premise when you say there appears to be a contradiction between the firefighters' accounts and other civilians on the scene. I don't see a contradiction. The reason why there are so many more firefighters is simply because we were given a text of 12,000 pages, and there they are. And we have to hunt for the civilians. Nobody, not the FBI, not NIST, not the 9/11 Commission, as far as we know, carried out a proper investigation of these eyewitnesses. So we don't know how many. There may be thousands of them.
Thank you.
Yes, welcome.
Professor Lee.
Here's a tough one. Could someone from Popular Mechanics assemble 156 statements that from eyewitnesses on the day of that didn't mention explosions?
Right.
And would that kind of cancel out this?
Right. Good question. It's difficult for me to answer the question when it comes to civilians and journalists, simply because this would be a very large research project. You would have to gather all the statements in the newspapers and on TV, radio, and everything, and that would be a lot of work. And then you would try and work out which ones talked about explosions, which ones seemed to be supporting structural failure, and so on. However, I did try to do this in my 2006 article on the firefighters. I was curious to know, if I read these 10,000 pages, how many explosion references there would be, but also how many references there would be that would seem to support structural failure hypothesis. And especially since they seem to be talking about pancaking a lot, how many would support that? So in the article, I did try to draw up a list of both the explosion witnesses and the kind of structural failure people. And the structural failure column was very small compared to the eyewitnesses. I don't remember anymore. It's something like 21 people as compared with 118, something like that.
Do we have, I can see Professor Jenkins writing. Is that another question emerging?
No, thank you.
Professor Lee again.
Well, since we have a couple more minutes, I'm very intrigued. You had the, some reporter asks Giuliani and uses the word, the female reporter uses the word explosions and so on as a given. And but you don't mention Giuliani's response.
Right. Yes, so as I say, he was asked twice during the day. When he's asked in the morning about the explosion, it's actually Aaron Brown, anchor for CNN, who asked him. Giuliani, I don't remember his exact words, but he basically says, I don't know. In the afternoon, by 2:39, he sort of knows. He says, we now think that it's just the planes.
Because he certainly is a prima facie candidate for an insider.
Well, I mean, I assume he was briefed. I don't see how else he could have discovered within a few hours that this was not a controlled... Again, it's absurd to think that somebody could have discovered on 9/11 itself why these buildings came down. So somebody, I assume, briefed him or whatever.
Do we have other questions? Thank you very much then, Professor MacQueen, for your presentation.